All right. Welcome everyone who's already been able to join. Really excited to have you here today. Signifyd hosts a series of webinars. We've themed it Crimes and Cocktails. It's a offshoot from some internal stories that we shared at some of our all hands and with some of our friends in the commerce network, from financial institutions to merchants to the media. And we love sharing these stories and our learnings. Today, we're going to talk about the Visa's new compelling evidence rules with some experts on my team. Really excited to have that session with you today, but we're going to start with a poll. And so would love for you all to participate. We're going to have a series of simple questions. Love for you to participate. It will help guide the discussion a little bit, make sure that we're giving stuff that's relevant to you. And if you have any questions, please do use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen for Zoom. You can ask those. If we have time, we'll answer them as we kind of go through. If we aren't able to get to them, we'll be happy to follow up and provide those answers at a later time. So without further ado, let's get into the first poll. And so could start the poll. Thank you so much. All right. Would you say consumer abuse and chargebacks are a primary concern for your organization right now? Yes, no, or hard to say. And obviously you're self-selecting into this. So very curious what people, think about, not just for their own work streams and kind of their own teams, but what about for your organization as a whole? Our chargebacks and consumer abuse is understanding what consumers or bad actors are trying to do on your e-commerce sites, in your retail experience, in your payments experience. Is that a focus and a primary concern for your organization right now? All right, and we'll leave that poll up for a little bit so that you can answer the poll, and we'll revisit it here in a second. I did want to introduce myself. So I'm Bennett. I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Signifyd. I'm responsible for the end-to-end customer journey of our merchants and our financial institution partners that work with us. Signifyd provides visibility into the customer journey and helps make retailers and financial institutions make decisions that lead to the best outcomes for their own customers. And so talk a little bit about what that means, but on my team, I have Doug and Tara who have joined me today for today's webinar. Doug manages our chargeback operations worldwide. He has joined us from Microsoft and Amazon. Tara joined us recently from Wish. She also had experience at Uber and Etsy. And so we have great experience from the merchant side, from the marketplace side, and with some payments experience as well. So really excited to have them talk to you today. The world is changing a little bit with the Visa rules. And so now is a great time to make sure you're up to speed on those and understanding what you can be doing to be ready to use those Visa rules. So, all right. And if we can maybe close the poll, that might be good. And if get the results. All right, so 2/3 fully say yes, that chargebacks, probably more so consumer abuse, are kind of top of choice. I'm very curious for folks as they go through this as we talk about how consumer abuse leads to chargebacks from that perspective. But definitely solid majority are saying yes. Some are saying it's hard to say, maybe, in terms of whether or not we're actually investing it or not. So the folks on this call from Signifyd are definitely focused on consumer abuse and chargebacks. That's what we focus on a lot of our day on. So you have met the speakers. You'll hear from Doug and Tara on each of these sections. Doug's going to go over some chargeback overviews and trends. Tara's going to talk about Visa's new compelling evidence rules. Go back to Doug to give 2 examples of some chargebacks and some ways that Signifyd has helped stop consumer abuse, or what's oftentimes called first-party fraud, as well as true financial fraud. So both types of chargebacks. We'll zoom back and say, hey, how can you protect your business in 2023? And then if we have any time for questions at the end, and we'll do a quick wrap up. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to Doug. Sorry, I lied. Give me 1 second. And let's talk about a little bit deeper about what Signifyd does. So I mentioned that Signifyd helps retailers and financial institutions make decisions across the customer journey. So what we're going to talk about today is very specific to chargebacks and how to manage the dispute element here, this last leg of the journey on that part. But before it gets to a dispute, there could be a return, there could be a refund request that could be abused, there could be a rerouted shipment and fulfillment, or maybe you have it go to a reshipper, and so you don't actually know who your end customer is. You could have in the checkout, you could have somebody use stolen financials. You could have, before that, you have somebody take advantage of promotions. You could have somebody test cards if you don't have a secure environment. You could have somebody do credential stuffing and try to create a whole bunch of accounts or to take over somebody else's account. And so you can see how the scope of what needs to be protected is really overwhelming. And so what we found is Signifyd started in the checkout as a way to help make decisions of what you should ship or not ship. And our merchants that we've worked with and the financial institutions we've worked with have asked us to help make decisions further on. Today, though, we're really going to focus on that last bubble, the dispute. What happens when a consumer says, hey, the good isn't what I thought it was, or hey, I never paid for that, or hey, somebody stole my card. That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, Doug, sorry, would love for you to come and talk a little bit about the basics of chargebacks.
Perfect. Thanks, Bennett. Super excited to be here. Always looking forward to opportunities to talk about chargebacks with anybody willing to listen. And so before we go into the details of the new compelling evidence rules that Visa rolled out, I thought it would be good to just start with the high level Chargebacks 101. And so we'll start with just what is a chargeback. And a chargeback is a reversal of funds after a shopper disputes a transaction with their credit card company. And so there's many different reasons why somebody might file a chargeback. I think the one we're most familiar with is fraud. So that's the scenario where a cardholder gets their bank statement, sees a transaction that they don't recognize, calls their bank, says, hey, I didn't make this purchase, and the bank files a fraud reason code chargeback. But there's a lot of other reasons why somebody might file a chargeback, and we break these into 3 categories. Obviously, the first one is fraud, but the second category that we have is customer disputes, and that would be for item not received, significantly not as described, canceled merchandise. And so in these scenarios, the cardholder admits that they made the purchase. They're just unhappy with it. They never received it. It was damaged or defective or not as described. And so that's the second category. And then the third category is processing issues. So that's where a cardholder says, hey, you charged me twice, or you charged me the wrong amount. You charged the wrong credit card. I never got my credit that you said you're going to process. And so those are the 3 categories of chargebacks that we see. Fraud obviously making up the majority of what we see within chargebacks, but a growing segment is that customer disputes, where you see it almost makes up about 1/3 of total chargebacks, and then processing errors is a smaller segment of about 7%. But no matter what reason or category it is, the impact of chargebacks really hits merchants the hardest. They're out the money, they're out their product. Every chargeback has a fee associated with it. Merchants can get put on chargeback monitoring programs that are really hard to get off of. There's a lot of hoops you have to jump through, and there's a lot of fines that are associated with those. And if you really have a problem, you could lose the ability to transact with that card network. And so for us, we look at it as, for merchants, they need a scalable chargeback strategy that comes down to 3 elements: prevention, protection, and representment. Now, with that said, it'll be good to just go into what are the trends that we're seeing in 2023. And so for 2023, we're seeing that we're a growth in consumer abuse. It's growing faster than third-party criminal fraud. And what we define as consumer abuse is what I talked about previously. It's the item not received, it's the significantly not as described, it's canceled merchandise, it's those customer disputes. We're seeing that grow 41% year over year. Particularly within the leisure and outdoor, fashion, apparel and luggage, beauty, cosmetics, groceries, household goods, and consumer medical supplies and supplements. We're still seeing a growth within the criminal fraud, which we define as account takeovers, stolen financials, anything that's really within a fraud ring or just true fraud. There's a 17% growth there. Really, that's really being driven within the general merchandise, business supplies as well. And then interestingly enough, we do see an actual decrease in both consumer abuse and criminal fraud within the alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis segment.
Yeah, you'll see me come back on to comment. I love, and there's also a question that I'm going to answer from the an attendee, which I think is a great one. So alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis, and these medical supplies, this is a weird year-over-year comp, right? And been quite a journey for 3 years. We had COVID, people couldn't go out to bars. So obviously the fraud rings or consumers would want to try to steal alcohol, right? From that perspective. And so from that, it's really interesting to track this by type of good, but also there are macroeconomic conditions here, right? Of, hey, what can I steal? What can I sell? That's ultimately what someone is trying to do here. Very rarely, or rather not consistently, is a consumer going to steal for their own use. If you try to think about small time like that, I might steal once or twice a year, maybe at most. The fraud rings or the more sophisticated return rings or abuse rings, those that are committing consumer abuse at a much larger scale, that's more what we're seeing retailers really face. The question from one of the attendees was, hey, do you track consumer disputes? Absolutely, yes. That's how we built the data here of like, hey, what's happening over time? And definitely different retailers are seeing different types of chargebacks. We'll see it come and go in waves from that perspective. And so there's then a follow-up very specific question about how to manage those disputes with cardholders, which I think we'll get to when we get to some of the later sections. So thanks, Doug. I think that's very interesting data, and hopefully gives an indication of a lot of the types of data that Signifyd has within our network. All right.
I think with that, we'll pass it off to Tara to start talking about the new changes.
Hi, folks. I'm Tara Mitchell. I'm excited to be here to talk to you about the new Visa compelling evidence rules. So these are rules that Visa rolled out in April 15th of this year. So they're going to be taking effect to all merchants across all acquirers and all issuers. So if it is a Visa branded card, it is eligible for the new Visa compelling evidence rules. You do not have to opt into it. Now, the reason that Visa rolled out these new rules was actually because of a lot of feedback from merchants like us, that a lot of what we are seeing in the cases of friendly fraud, customers abusing the ability to file chargebacks against merchants when they were just not happy and calling it fraud, was really impacting our business. So this is Visa's first effort towards addressing a lot of those concerns for merchants by making it easier for merchants to prove that what is being alleged as fraud is not actually true fraud. And we were genuinely correct in assuming that this was a good intentioned user making a good purchase. So these new rules apply to chargebacks filed under the fraud reason code. So if you're familiar with the fraud reason codes that Visa uses, this is reason 10.4, fraudulent transaction. And the intention here is that merchants can, instead of representing a specific chargeback, can show a pattern of behavior over the customer's lifetime that shows that they have good transactions in the past, that has built up a historical perspective that this is a good user. From the merchant's perspective, talking to the customer, what they also want is to facilitate a discussion that they can kind of arbitrate that shows the customer that the merchant has previous history doing business with them. And if perhaps they forgot about a transaction or they didn't recognize it, that they have done business with that merchant before in the same transaction style. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. But trying to help a customer or a cardholder recognize the transaction if it is a genuine case that they did not recognize the transaction even though they made it, and they filed a chargeback in good faith because they didn't recognize it, giving them the tools they need to recognize that behavior and recognize that this was a transaction they placed. So there are some components of this that are very focused on giving the information to the customer that is going to help them recognize that chargeback as their own. So As I mentioned, this is looking at a pattern of behavior. So Visa compelling evidence is not necessarily based on what you have specific to the identity verification at the time of the chargeback and transaction, but can you establish a history of previous transactions with this customer or cardholder that show that they have operated in good faith with you in the past? So this means you need to look back. The transactions need to be anywhere from 120 days old to no more than a year old. This is to make sure that if a transaction is maybe 3 days old, it might be something that was actually part of the same fraud attack. But over 120 days old, the assumption is the cardholder has had enough time to dispute that as fraud. At that point, we can assume that this was a good faith transaction. It also can't be more than a year old. And this, for some users, might be a little bit frustrating if you're on like an annual subscription model. But the assumption is at that point, it's also in recent enough memory that shows that the behavior of the customer is consistent. You need to find at least 2 matching transactions in the customer's history with you. And they need to have at least 2 of the following data points matching with the current transaction that is being charged back. So the options you have, and I'll go into more in depth how you're going to mix and match those in the next slide, are IP address, device ID, could also be a device fingerprint, the user account, and the shipping address. So you have 4, really kind of 5, if you call device ID and device fingerprint 2 different things, 5 different data points that you can play with there. Additionally to this, you need to provide the description of the items purchased. So I mentioned this is the focus on helping the cardholders recognize their previous purchase history and recognize the transaction so that they're willing to accept that the transaction is valid, and the issuer can have, and the issuer and the bank can have that conversation with the cardholder and have them recognize that we are operating in good faith, they made a mistake. Other things to keep in mind are that the matching transactions have to be processed through the same acquirer. So if you're a merchant who is acquiring using multiple acquirers, you're using Braintree, Stripe, Adyen to process transactions, you're not going to be able to look across your entire acquirer base for transactions. They have to have been processed through the same acquirer. So if you're getting a chargeback on a transaction via Braintree, you need to find 2 other matching ones that were also processed through Braintree. Another thing to take into consideration is that the transactions, if you are a non-physical goods merchant and nothing is shipping, I'm thinking of digital goods, I'm thinking of recurring subscriptions, monthly subscription plans, things like that, you cannot use the billing address as a substitute for shipping address. So in those scenarios, it doesn't count as a common element. This is something that has been escalated to Visa, that they understand that a lot of merchants aren't shipping physical goods, and that's going to make it a little bit more difficult for them, but you still do have other common elements that you can use. Final thing I want to emphasize here is that this is a burden of proof on us as merchants to provide, but once we meet that burden of proof, it shifts the liability to the issuers. So if we provide 2 transactions that meet these criteria that match, the issuers can only push back to us as merchants if there is blatant manipulation of the data points. And when Visa says blatant, they need an IP address of all zeros, or a shipping address where we've just put in like the letter A over and over again. So it's not necessarily manipulation by the customer or the cardholder, but manipulation that is clearly on behalf of the merchant. So in that point, as long as we're operating in good faith and providing this, Visa will ensure that the liability goes back to the issuer. So I mentioned there are a couple different data points that have to be provided, and in some cases you can mix and match. So there are some minimum required fields that have to be provided to Visa for every one of these chargebacks, and as well as the transactions that are being used to match. So as I mentioned, product description, store name, these are things that are the intention to show the cardholder that this is what you bought, you have a history of purchasing from this specific store, here's the recognizable information that's going to help you remember the transaction and identify it. Obviously, merchant name, merchant URL, merchant contact phone. This is so that they can identify the merchant, they can reach out if there are further questions, but it establishes the merchant's identity. For folks who are doing business under different names or who might have their merchant descriptors coming up a little bit different, this is to reinforce the merchant's identity of the person I bought from is the person I'm now seeing the charge from. Now, you have to use at least a device ID, a device fingerprint, or an IP address. So one of the common elements has to be one of those things. And that establishes that in an e-commerce environment, the transaction was placed either from a recognized IP address or the device that has been previously used. So a consistent behavior. So for cases like account takeover, this is really to eliminate that possibility to show that we have consistent purchasing behavior from the same device or the same IP. So you can't just say, oh, it's the same shipping address, it's the same account. We have to prove that it was the same user's device or IP that was making the transaction. Beyond that, you can kind of mix and match based on what you have. You're not limited to providing only 2 common points of data. You can actually provide all of them if you have them, and you're probably making a better case if you do. But a delivery address, including the address, city, region, postal code, and country, a device fingerprint or a device ID, an account ID. An account ID can be anything from the email address used to sign up, a unique username. It can't be just like an internally designed, like UID. It has to be something that is recognizable and assigned to the cardholder, but to show that this is the same account that they have purchased from in the past with a specific attribute that identifies this account within your systems, as well as with something that the bank can see commonality on. So showing that this is not just a guest checkout account or something like that. So how are merchants preparing to deal with all these changes? Well, the changes are live, and there's a lot of things that merchants can do to prepare for them, as well as adapt. So if you are representing your own chargebacks, you're going to need to think about revisiting what evidence you're providing, because this opens up a huge door to address friendly fraud chargebacks that you previously might not have been able to. You're going to want to look at what you're producing in your representment packet, sending back in these claims, and make sure that if you have chargebacks that are eligible for Visa CE 3.0, you're sending back those matching transactions and the associated data points that need to be proven for those. You're also going to need to think about the logic. So if you're not used to going back and looking at historical transactions to provide proof of history with a user, you're going to want to make sure that you're identifying the ones that are eligible for Visa CE 3 and having logic to go back and look up those transactions and pull the correct ones. So one other thing to consider is that if you're leveraging a pre-chargeback solution, specifically from Visa, since these are Visa rules, you can actually integrate with their API. So one of the good things about Visa CE 3 is that it's not exclusive to the chargeback process. It is actually both chargeback process as well as pre-dispute process. So if you are receiving fraud alerts or pre-chargeback alerts, you can respond to those with the same level of evidence at that point. So you can do it even via an API integration that will automatically deflect these transactions. And if you do, that actually removes that chargeback or that pre-chargeback from counting against both your fraud ratio and your dispute ratio for both Visa programs. So if you have one of the Visa pre-chargeback solutions in place, I highly recommend looking at whether or not you can directly integrate with them to deflect a lot of those chargebacks at the pre-chargeback level and remove that liability. One thing to keep in mind also is standardizing your credit card descriptors. So this isn't necessarily something that comes to mind immediately, but Visa is going to be trying to match your merchant descriptor to show that these are purchases from the same merchant. And of course, we all feel of ourselves like, yes, we're the same merchant, but it needs to match between transactions, that it is clear to the cardholder that this is the same merchant. So if you are using dynamic descriptors that maybe have different appendings for each one, there needs to be a consistent part of the merchant descriptor that identifies your business as the same business. So if you're doing business in multiple countries and you have different descriptors, it's okay if part of that is different, but as much as possible, you want them to be consistent among the transactions so that it's clear that this business line is the same business and coming from the same merchant. Business line and purchase type will also influence whether Visa considers those transactions to match. So if you are a business that does 2 widely different things and they purchased one and then the other, it's going to be a little bit harder to match that as the same merchant versus if it's a consistent purchase type that they're buying the similar types of items from you in the same business line. Finally, if you are manually representing, depending on your size, you probably want to talk to your PSP and make sure that if there are going to be changes to your PSP's portal, you're training your team on how to adapt to that, to submit this evidence properly if you're manually representing. And even if you're a big company and maybe you're not manually representing, but you're thinking about whether you need to outsource or whether you need to scale, if you're talking to your issuers, talk to them about how Visa CE 3 is going to impact your business, because they're going to be taking on additional liability shift. They're going to be having those conversations with your card holders for you. And you want to make sure that you're in alignment with them about how this is going to impact your working relationship as well as liability shifts for these kinds of chargebacks. So having gone through the basics of Visa CE 3, I wanted to throw out another question to the team, to the listeners. So, how prepared do you feel regarding the new Visa Compelling Evidence 3.0 guidelines? And just popped up there, very prepared, not prepared, hard to say. Obviously, these are very new guidelines, so it's hard to necessarily know how everything is going to play out. But just to gauge to see how comfortable do you feel in adapting to these new guidelines and being prepared for the changes to your business?
I see some chatter in the Q&A about, oh gosh, like if people are changing their devices or their IPs, like am I even tracking this? I would put that in, not prepared or maybe hard to say. As Tara excellently described, some businesses might not have 120 days to a year's worth of data to pull on, and so that can make it difficult. It's more of a, if you can opt into it, it can be a great way to definitively get the funds and to make the chargeback life cycle much shorter, avoid pre-arbitration and all of that mess that can really extend. As you all finish the poll, I see a couple more interesting questions I just want to answer live. Within the fraud category, do you think it's principally true fraud? No. Is there some or a lot of consumer fraud in there? Yes. The analysts and the folks who I talk with estimate that as many as 50% to 70%, 50 to 70, of fraud-coded chargebacks are actually the consumer doesn't recognize the transaction, but they did actually make it. You heard Tara talk about, hey, make sure that you can get back to them, make sure you did actually buy this. Yes, I know that my merchant code on your statement is different from what you saw on the website, but that's me. You bought this thing. Or it's people who are trying to lie and trying to get the good. So a huge percentage of what are coded as fraud reason codes, chargebacks, are what we would call first party, either inadvertent, the consumer is just confused, or a little bit more malicious. From that perspective. A couple of the other questions, I think that our example chargebacks that Doug will talk you through will be right up your alley. So let's maybe close the poll if we can and get the results there. And feels like, as expected, half of folks here are like, gosh, it's really hard to say if I'm ready to take advantage of this Visa program. When I talk with folks, some business models, it is great. I have a subscription, right? I have somebody kind of buying stuff with me all the time. I can totally get this evidence, right, from that perspective. And for many other businesses, it's really hard. Only 20% of folks feel like you're very prepared. So I think as we move into Doug, let's bring you back and let's talk about some example cases and what compelling evidence might look like outside of the CE3 guidelines, but still very winnable.
Perfect. Yeah. With that said too, normally within the previous crimes and cocktails, we grab our most salacious and kind of egregious cases that we have great evidence of us going above and beyond in finding supported evidence to dispute chargebacks. I think one example that always I go back to is somebody filed a chargeback on an above ground pool where we obviously had great tracking and delivery information that would win the chargeback, but we went beyond and above using social media to show here's them throwing a pool party days after they received it, using Google Maps to find satellite imagery of their yard with the above ground pool in it, and like really going beyond what are required to win chargebacks. And so with the new compelling evidence, though, I think this is a good example of, it's still an egregious case of fraud and it's salacious. It's a customer bought a bunch of loose diamonds, which to me it doesn't make me laugh, but loose diamonds, it just makes me picture a velvet bag full of just a ton of diamonds in it that you always see in the movies where the robbers are taking it out of a safe. But in this case, the person bought loose diamonds with one as much as $43,000, so a big rock, right? And normally we would go and we would have to figure out, how are we going to prove they have this beyond just proof of delivery? But in this case, it was much more straightforward. We were able to leverage the data within our network to show, hey, they have previous purchase history with common data elements. In this case, it was IP address and delivery address that meet the requirements of the compelling evidence. And we were able to show that, hey, we have those 2 transactions that were within the timeframes, that shifts liability. We included proof of delivery just because that's still good business practice. But at the end of the day, our ability to recover $43,000 was much, much easier than it has been in the past by simply using the data that's available to us today. And so this is a great example of how this change really will help merchants going forward. And then in the second example, this second example is going to be a good example of customer abuse. In this case, this was a chargeback that was filed for item not received. The person purchased a watch for almost $100,000 and claimed they never received it. And so in this case, though, it's interesting because the customer purchased the watch, paid for next day delivery, but then immediately contacted Federal Express to put a vacation hold on that because they were going to be out of town for the next week, which is a huge red flag, obviously. Why would you buy that expensive watch? Why would you pay for next day shipping when you know you're not going to be there? So that was obviously a red flag to us. And because of those timeframes, because it was next day, FedEx wasn't able to actually uphold the vacation hold. And so they delivered it the next day. And we had proof that it was signed for. And it was the card holder who signed for it with name and signature. But we went beyond that and we looked and we really did a thorough investigation and found, hey, this person, I think, has found a loophole in the system because they've been able to do this in the past. They were able to get a $40,000 refund previously by doing the exact same thing, claiming that they never received the item, calling up the merchant saying, hey, I was out of town. It shows it was delivered, but I was never there. And unfortunately, the merchant did refund in that scenario. Luckily, in this scenario, the merchant didn't refund. We were able to use this evidence to show that the merchant, the card holder received the item just as they requested it. And we're able to recover almost $100K and prevent this customer from using that loophole further.
All right, I'm gonna jump in here with some interesting questions, Doug. So a little bit of hot seat here, but I think these should hopefully be good. So this is the one that is kind of FedEx or UPS or whatever, but FedEx locations, right? Okay, I'm going to reroute, or I'm going to have it picked up at a particular location, and then I'm going to come in and like pick it in with my ID. Talk to me a little bit about how that modulates the experience with proof of delivery evidence.
Yeah, that definitely can add complication to it, right? I think the straightforward cases are you delivered it to the address I asked for, and we have proof of that. But in those scenarios, it is more complicated. If they're picking up at a facility, we can still use that evidence that ID was required, that they were supposed to only deliver this to the recipient. But at times, if that doesn't work, we have then moved forward with helping the merchant file a claim directly with FedEx. If FedEx didn't follow their policies in that scenario, we can then help that merchant win a claim with FedEx directly. And so that's another route that if for whatever reason, FedEx doesn't hold up its end of the bargain, it's not necessarily going to give you liability shift for the chargeback, but it does help you then file a claim with them. Right. And obviously rerouting, we always recommend merchants don't allow that. And if you have that, requirement with your whatever delivery option you're having, they should hold to that. And if for whatever reason they deliver to a different address, again, that will be a claim that you can file directly with whoever it is, UPS, FedEx, or whoever the carrier is.
Right. So the summary of that is, yes, the evidence is different. Yes, you can sometimes win, but ultimately the process, you have to see where in the chain was the abuse taking advantage of, and did the partner actually do what they were supposed to do along that chain. Similar one, not similar, but another kind of process change in the logistics is, hey, how can you dispute if signatures aren't required because we just got out of a global pandemic and all of this? Talk about that. How has that changed the game?
Yeah, so that has complicated it as well. But signature is not always required for us to win with compelling evidence. As long as it's delivered to the shipping address. If you had if shipping address matches the billing address, that's even better. That is we know it was delivered to the cardholder's billing address. Signature isn't necessarily required in those scenarios. And so again, it's complicated because we're not always going to have it, but that is not a deal breaker by any means. It's additional support that really helps. But lack of it doesn't mean you're not going to be able to win. And so again, making sure you're delivering to where you say you're going to deliver it to, and hopefully that if it does match the billing address, that's even better. But we know at times that doesn't happen. You may deliver to a business. We can tie that person, if you can tie the card holder to the business, that's additional support that you can use regardless of signature. And so there's ways around that. Signature is just a good to have. It's not a necessarily have to have.
I think that's well said, right? And so oftentimes when I'm talking, whether it's about deciding on the account creation side, or should we even ship this in the first place, to should we dispute this chargeback or not, very rarely is there one single data element that says, yes, we should or should not do this, right? Full AVS match. Does that help? Of course, right? Shipping with signature to the address, of course that helps, right? But nothing is fatal and nothing is dispositive, except for these new Visa rules, right? And so that's one of the things that I think is most interesting about Visa coming out and providing with very clear guidelines. If you do these things, then you will get the recovery, right? And I don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't feel like we've ever had bright line rules like that in this industry. It's always been Susie in Oklahoma reviewing a packet, and what happens from there?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions here. And let me choose one here. All right. Okay, so there's quite a few questions that I'm going to chunk, and they're mainly to do with, hey, what should we do if a customer doesn't file a chargeback, but maybe they say, you know what, I didn't receive it, or hey, I haven't got it yet, and all of those types of things. So they don't file a chargeback, but maybe they initiate maybe a PayPal kind of process, or they reach out to the support team at the merchant. Kind of, how do you think about? I want to caution. This sounds like a great topic to talk with a Signifyd rep or to write into the website on. Every business is going to be different. We work with some of the largest retailers in the world, well, the largest retailers in the world and the largest marketplaces, and then also mom and pops on Shopify. So we see the full gamut in terms of customer experience. I'd love to have our team talk with you about, hey, how do I best calibrate my returns experience so that I shut down abuse, but also give the red carpet out to consumers? One thing that I would note is only 2 to 8% of returns are abusive. And so I don't think that you should be having a really bad customer experience because of 2% of bad actors in a relatively small part. If it's out of whack and you need to solve a problem, then maybe you should be providing more friction. But maybe you need some help with a service like Signifyd machine learning on the back end to say, who is that bad 2%? Don't give that 2% of refund requests. Don't let them actually get that immediately. Maybe put a little bit more friction for them. But for 98% of people, I think that the American consumer demands a really clean, easy returns experience. That's maybe how I want to kind of chunk those questions. Okay, all right. And then I might have confused someone with my verbiage. So Doug, if you want to come back, can you quickly explain the difference between a first chargeback and a second chargeback, or a first chargeback and pre-arb?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll start with the first chargeback and second chargeback. Typically applies with MasterCard, where you get a first chargeback, you're debited, you then have the ability to dispute it. Typically within that flow, once you dispute, you're given an automatic credit back, and then the issuer looks at your evidence and then decides, do I agree or disagree? And if they disagree, then they will file a second chargeback, which then redebits you again. You lose that credit, but you still have the ability to dispute it if you want. There there are some implications with that, though, of potentially having, arbitration and fees that are associated with that. So if it's a low dollar thing, you might not want to dispute it, because you may, if you lose it, end up having an additional $500 fee associated with that. So that's the concept of first and second chargebacks. And then a chargeback and a pre-arb and then arbitration is very, very similar, where a pre-arb will be what you'll dispute and submit a pre-arb. This will be for Visa specifically, a pre-arb. You'll dispute and submit a pre-arbitration. You're not credited at that point. The issuer will look at that and make a decision. If they reject it, then they continue to keep the money through the chargeback process. Or if they accept your evidence, you'll then be credited back. If they decline it, though, you have the option as a merchant to take that to arbitration. And again, that's similar to disputing a second chargeback. You have to be very careful with which ones you choose to do that for, because there are large fees associated to the loser of that dispute. And so if you win it, that's great. The issuer is assessed whatever fee that is, and you get your money back. But if you lose it, then you're taking on that additional fee. In the past, before compelling evidence, you never know how Visa is going to decide. They're typically, though, cardholder friendly, and it puts merchants at a huge disadvantage. So if you just have your normal compelling evidence, it's not a guarantee you're going to win in arbitration. But with these new rules, obviously, it's different. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as we go forward. But hopefully that answers that question about those two scenarios.
I think that's definitely the tenor of those questions. And I'll just add in, I think the best way to avoid pre-arbs is to provide the best compelling evidence you can in the first packet in a timely manner. And like all of our data shows, timely, complete packets, and obviously using the compelling evidence that Visa has provided is the clearest example of that. All right, so let's move on to the next poll. And so we have here, okay, all right. So we, Doug gave you a couple good examples of some compelling evidence, which included, tying together the transaction with the actual fulfillment, right? Tying together the consumer with the payment instrument. How confident are you in your orgs and your team's ability to gather the required compelling evidence? So polls up, great. Let's see here. Right. And then I'm going to bump forward a little bit. We are moving along. The poll will stay open for a little bit more. And so just as a reminder in terms of kind of how you can think about protecting your business in 2023 and beyond, really, I think that the key thing, if I had to abstract what Visa and Amex and the card networks are wanting, they really want their cardholders to have clear communication from the retailers end to end. They want to know, what are the terms that I'm making this purchase on? What are the terms of me being able to cancel or get a refund? When is the thing going to ship? What are the return policies, the refund policies? All of that end to end, the clarity and the crispness of communication to the cardholder. That's what the card brands and the networks are trying to communicate. They really want to have their security around that. They want to try to prevent fraud. They want to try to prevent consumer misunderstandings as they're purchasing things. So the things that you can do about being able to do that is making, coming back to the points that Tara mentioned of, being clear about the merchant identifier codes and all of the names that will appear on the consumer's bank statement, potentially leveraging services to provide that information to the issuers like Visa or other kind of services that allow you to show the consumer, yes, you did buy this, remember, you signed up for this, or yes, you did order this, and just that timely manner can really prevent a lot of those chargebacks. You really want to use early alerting as much as possible as well. And so if you have a fraud attack or you have a sudden change in your chargebacks, chargebacks can take, usually 2 weeks. You might get enough chargebacks to be able to start making some analyses that are actually statistically relevant, but the full cycle can be up to 6 months or longer if you decide to go to pre-arb. And so if you're waiting for a month to make a decision about your business, that's too long. And so you need to either be monitoring those early alerts, or you need to have a system in place to be able to help you do that. You also, if you need to, as the abuse increases, Doug shared the numbers, the abuse is increasing, the fraud is increasing, the amount of chargebacks is increasing. We're seeing this across the board, across the world, period, actually, and then also specifically in the United States, with the economy being the way that it is, with inflation being the way that it is, we see these trends only increasing. And so if that pressure is getting too much, you might need to consider outsourcing some or all of these processes, or getting some help from that perspective. So let's maybe close the poll. I'm curious how folks feel about this. Yeah, so about half folks are very confident. Yeah, I can get the evidence from that perspective, but the other half are either not confident or not sure. And so I think that's super interesting that, despite Visa trying to provide these very clear guidelines, or, these kind of nuts and bolts of data elements, can be very hard to stitch. And so, we have a lot of people here, a lot of, professionals that are focused on this. And even then, we're not able to, half of folks aren't able to get what they need out of it. All right. So do you want to preview a couple other points? So we are about to launch the State of Commerce 2023. It is a really neat report. It's going to come out on July 25th. You'll receive a copy via email. I didn't mention this earlier, but Signifyd has more than 600 million wallets in our ecosystem of folks who have made a payment and had bought something in a card not present environment. Around the world. We have great visibility into pricing and mix shift and promotions and all kinds of stuff. So we love to talk about what we're seeing in the broader macro economy and what that means for retailers and financial institutions. You'll get that. Trends that we are seeing in types of abuse and types of losses, and business opportunities will be in there as well. Really neat report. If you had a question that we weren't able to get to today, please do reach out to your Signifyd rep. They can help direct you. If you're interested in a custom State of Commerce e-commerce briefing, I'm happy to do that. I love doing that. My team, I hired them away from Walmart and from investment banks that do these types of briefings. We love to talk about this with retailers and our partners. We'd love to schedule that with you. You can, again, reach out to your Signifyd rep or send any questions on our website from that perspective. All right. So then if we, just a little bit of what you can expect in the state of commerce. So, hey, what are we seeing? We're seeing some modulation in terms of sales. We see consumers and their spending habits changing a little bit. And then obviously the people who are winning are maximizing customer lifetime value. And then, hey, you have a little bit of what is actually working in 2023 and what can you focus on to have a really excellent holiday season. As a thanks for attending, you'll get a free gift. Apologies if you're in a jurisdiction where we're not able to send that to you. But in keeping with the theme of crimes and cocktails, we talked a little bit about some of the criminals. Here's the cocktail that you can have on us. Hopefully you can have a fun mocktail kit. And I think that this is a really great theme for this. Really enjoy these. Please do reach out if you have any questions regarding any of that information that we can help with. And thanks so much for your engagement.